Well, Jürgen Feldhoff, Bielefeld University. I wouldn't add another general question because Mr. Schimank had such a lot of questions and you will have a lot of tasks to answer to them. I will ask for an example which is for me personally in the moment very important. It's the question how to introduce the memorializing, the historical memory in the question of methodological nationalism, which could fail only if we got how to get rid of it, or into the case of world society, which also makes big difficulties if I want to memorize something which leads me to the understanding of my own situation. Memorizing history to understanding presence for understanding future. It's, for me, very important, and the connection to history was very vague today here in this audience. So let me take the example, bring it to Mr. Lesnich, who argued with economic structures, with economic exchange, and with economic exploration. This is understandable. But if I come to the memory, I come to, for instance, the example of Second World War and the specifics of this big historical background of our society today and our future. How to bring it inside, how to bring the specific racism of this event, the specific social and political identity which must be built up after this big historical decade, how to bring it into what you called a world historical perspective, which I pretty don't understand what it is, a world historical perspective. I understood a bit the economic, but I didn't understand the cultural elements of our development and how do you do it. And mustn't we go on in the way that we understand why did we lose the whole discussion of methodological nationalism? Maybe nationalism came back and so we have not problem to accept it. Maybe we don't feel in what situation we live. And maybe we must understand the historical background of today or yesterday of our theories. They have a background, and why do we have world society theory, and why did we have such a theory of coming back of methodological nationalism, perhaps first in reality and later again in theory. So my question is how to bring in the question of historical memory into your aspects, which I couldn't follow and I didn't understand the message under this aspect. It's an example, and there are perhaps more. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to answer? May I answer to this question in the context of two comments to the earlier commentators, our presentations? Thank you very much, because I think that will then lead to well, not an answer, but a reflection on your intervention. First of all, my first comment goes to Julian, because I absolutely share your second move or your criticism of earlier global theories in the sense of universalizing the provincial and then the moves with Dubois and Bourdieu. I would say that in your reconstruction of world systems theory, well, in a sense, you lost the last 10 years, because my argument was that Krasniewicz and Morin stand for a move away in the sense of de-economizing and de-Europeanizing world systems theory. And I could have said that there's a second very important book together with the one by Krasniewicz and Morin, which is Manuela Władka, who tried to integrate a Marxian and a Weberian perspective under a post-colonial, in the post-colonial framework. And she's working on a world systems theory and world historical perspective, which takes into account different experiences in different locations of the globe. And this world systems and world historical perspective would make, in an economical dimension, would say, well, what I call the high inequality equilibrium in the global, on certain places of the global south. In a certain phase of history, they had a comparative advantage. This was a specialization, extractivism and unfree labor, slavery. This was a specialization where the colonial economies for some time had a comparative advantage against other developmental paths. And then they were outruled by the closure of markets and the closure of political economies from the global north. So there's a perspective on specific varieties of not only economies but cultures of with racialized economies and racialized cultures in the global south, which in a certain phase of history were like dominant in the world economy in their subordinated position, and then they were throughout the world market by the economies and cultures of the center. So I think that there is a move away from an over-economized and over-Europeanized form of world systems theory. And to Uwe Schimank, I think it's for sure that there won't be something like a global state or a global society if you think of it in the sense of universalizing the provincial. So the concrete form of stateness and societal organization and influence, self-influencing of society via the state as experienced in the West. So I think if you think there should be possibly something on the global level that scales up what we have experienced in the West, then I think that won't be the case. But the other experiences in other parts of the world, experiences of self-influencing the conditions of life through politics and not through the state, these other southern experiences, for example, may frame our understanding, or should frame as well, our understanding of what could be another form of societalization in the future. So I think the notions of a global state or global society are in themselves like a universalization of particular experience in certain places of the world. And I think historical memory comes in if you take seriously the experiences of people in the global south. For example, in this high inequality equilibria, you can only understand Brazil, and not only in its economic inequality, social inequality, but in the political developments of the last 3 years, you can understand this only by the historical memory of the colonialization and decolonization of Brazil. And I think in world systems theory, you have at least the possibility of grasping these historical experiences theoretically.
Want to respond? Okay, further questions, comments?
No, I agree that the history of the theories are crucial. I think that's an important point. And here, I think that when you look at the history of theories, it's unavoidable, the conclusion that all theories are provincial in the sense that they always start, from the particular subjectivity of a particular standpoint. So I think that, with Sina's point about diagnostic versus, social theory, I don't think that the danger is in construing. That gets back to the commentator. I don't think that that's a situation of objectivity versus subjectivity, right? I think that the theory, social theorizing, is all subjective as well, in the sense that the questions we ask are subjective, right? So for me to even ask about differentiation is already to insinuate a certain standpoint. So you can't have, I think the distinction is not between subjective and objective. That I think diagnostic is just a different way of doing a subjective type of research. I think it's actually a little bit more honest and reflexive about its subjectivity. The problem with so-called objective theories, to which the diagnostic would seem to be opposed, is that they pretend they're not subjective, Right? So I think that's a huge problem. But so the theories themselves, I think one thing you learn from looking at the histories of these theories is that they all are coming from, they all have a history, they're all rooted in particular standpoints, and much of social theory, for example, is rooted in, of course, the Anglo-European experience, even though, of course, now there's changes to that. But historically, at least sociology in the United States emerges as a tool of empire, as a way of looking at the world from the imperial standpoint. The questions sociology asked are rooted in the concerns and interests of the empire. So it was always a sort of top-down kind of approach. So I think the history of the theories is really important. And I think when you look at the history of the theories, I think the question of historical memory, you can't avoid the problem of plurality, which the discussant brought up. I don't think that you can have a singular historical memory that everyone shares. I think you can have a shared object or a set of shared objects, but there's always going to be different memories of that same object.
All right. Questions, remarks? If not, I may pose one myself. But I always find interesting about this discussion about methodological nationalism and going beyond it, right? So we are very much, I think, in accordance with this project of going beyond methodological nationalism. But one of the reasons why I'm increasingly interested in nationalism that actually relates to the question of Professor Feldhoff is that we then have to explain for this persistence of methodological nationalism. Right? You started out with this for 50 years of criticism and kind of this inherent disappointment about the ineffectiveness of the criticism. So I think that really points to the question, how does this, say, national standpoint, to use Julian's parlance, come into play historically? And I think it's important to note that this is not so long ago than is often insinuated in the literature, right? So like the first nationalists come up in the 18th, 19th century, and there is methodological nationalism, and then that's the problem. But it seems to me, and I think historical work shows that, a much more recent invention, say, of the 40s and 50s, right, when the nation state became really consolidated as a global institution, and then also this kind of thinking became consolidated. And that leads to us, I think, kind of bouncing around between this effort of going beyond methodological nationalism and coming back to the discovery that it's really a very strong global institution. Right? And I think that's where I really agree with Uwe Schimang's remark. I wouldn't say necessarily we would have to call these entities national societies. We could talk about that. But we certainly have to acknowledge the robust, degree of institutionalization that kind of also is at the heart of methodological nationalism, right? So, and in many ways, I think we have to be, that has to be one of our perspectives on the whole process, one that takes much more seriously that the nationalization of social processes is actually part of world history, the making of world society, or whatever you want to call it.
Just to comment on that, I think that's an important point because from my understanding of at least American sociology, and maybe this applies to European sociology, I mean, methodological nationalism is really a product of the post-World War II period. And before that, if you actually read some of the early sociologists, and I'm not talking here about Weber, Marx, and Durkheim, the invented ones. I'm talking about the people that founded the Chicago School, people and other scholars like Giddens. The social sciences, they really didn't think about nation states the way we do. The primary categories were either small-scale communities or races and civilizations. And there's a wonderful book by Robert Vitalis who traces the history of political science and international relations back to the early 20th century. And the initial categories were never nations. What the early social scientists were interested in were races and the global struggle, the global race struggle. So the category there of human interaction was either global or it was more actually about races and civilizations interacting, not nations interacting. And I think what happens with the fall of empires and after World War II, when the world becomes sort of more organized around nation-state lines, then social science organizes itself around that category. And it loses that prior focus on civilizations or diasporas or races and cultures as the main categories. So I think it's important to think about the history of methodological nationalism as well, and it is very, I think it's very recent, and some of the early sociology, just looking at it, shows how, you know, for them, thinking about the world in terms of independent nation states would make no sense, and a lot of the early theories weren't about independent nation states.
I think that is your last argument was a very nice argument, which underlines what I wanted to emphasize. Society is a social construction, so we cannot define it in an objective way as sociologists. We have to look at how what people understand as society, and it's very true that the big time of society as a concept, not only of sociology, but also in the public opinion and the public self-understanding, was the time after World War II, for the reasons that you mentioned, yeah.
Well, but I wouldn't go so, if I understood you right, I wouldn't go so far in subjectifying society as a concept, because I think world systems theory or theories transcending the methodological nationalism point to the fact that local entities and processes, institutional frameworks and so on, are like in the sense of Simmel, an instance of cross-cutting social circles and functional circles, and get their individualities, their national individuality out of this being placed at the intersection of different cross-cutting circles and functional realms. So I think there may be a point for objectively defining what is society at a specific time space, but the subjective dimension certainly plays a role. I wanted to add only for the minutes that certainly any world systems theory would never deny that national state histories or national factors don't play a role. But that's historically there were, I think, regarding your question, there were certain structures of power that contributed to the emergence of methodological nationalism. So the certain position Western sociology takes and has taken in world sociology or in the world science system in the last 100 or 150 years certainly is a factor for the institutional inertia leading to the stability of methodological nationalism. So I think methodological nationalism in itself is like a mirror of certain structures of power in the world system.
Yeah, I mean, my point was just, so in the effort of going beyond methodological nationalism, we shouldn't forget that there's actually nationalism involved in creating methodological nationalism, right? So it should be an object of analysis too, not just that something that we take for granted as now something that we have to overcome. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm interested in it as an empirical research object. So, some questions emerging from this discussion? Yeah?
I want to thank Tobias for making his way up here, and thanks to all four of you for your very inspiring and succinct presentations. There is one aspect, and I know it's always a bad thing, you know, to point out stuff that hasn't been talked about as opposed to stuff that has been talked about. But one thing I was missing beside class, which we've heard about a lot, and race, which we've also heard about today, is the aspect of gender, and particularly maybe to Julian also because you work with standpoint theory, as far as I understood you. I was just basically generally wondering how you folks deal with gender in your theorizing. And interestingly, the only aspect or the only instance where the category kind of came up was Professor Farzin's example of, I think it was, I don't remember the author, but Jill Lepore, the work on the history of the United States, and sort of also including, as far as I haven't read the book, but a gendered category, and seeing as gender, or as imperialism, nationalism, et cetera, always have a gendered aspect. I was just wondering how you folks deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a minute. You could start, I guess. You.
To the tradition of post-colonial feminist theory, which of course is urging us to go beyond methodological nationalism and the sense of thinking about global social relations as primarily a gender hierarchy. And so I would turn to that, and I would have definitely included that, which is also, of course, rooted always in some understanding of some kind of local gender relations, which you then scale upwards, and which, like race, has a problem because then you're taking the category gender from that particular site, wherever it be, and then trying to apply it on a global scale. You have that same problem with race, right? This is one of the problems with Du Bois, taking, you know, race and applying it all around the world, when in those societies, or in some situations, maybe race isn't thought of in that same way. So you'd have the same issue with gender. But nonetheless, I would say that the starting move for theorizing something like gender on a global scale would be important, and then you would have to deal with these problems of how you differentiate between the analyst's category of gender and then actually what the gender in practice category. And there are ways to think about that, but I think you're right to point out gender is a possibly important area of theorizing that we didn't discuss.
Yes, I would totally agree to that too, also because in the discussion now we sort of stabilizing this conception that we perceive nations, or we have to overcome methodological nationalism because it's super inclusive to the inside and super exclusive to the outside. We miss the whole outside, the connectedness, the global hierarchies and so on. And Jill Lepore is a really good example probably for this. We are sort of painting a too rosy picture of the super inclusiveness of the nation state as a concept. If you bring race in like Du Bois did, and Julian just showed us that, or if you bring gender in, you will see that the problems of exclusion and marginalization, of course, were something nation states had to deal with internally. If you look at the history of voting rights, which is probably an area where you can easily show for all nation states how voting rights were granted only to very particular populations, white male people with property in the beginning, and then it was a gradual concept of reclaiming those rights and becoming more inclusive. You also get first ideas why this category is so robust, because it sort of is in terms of scale, it's a battleground you can play on easier than on the global scale. And it not only brings up problems, but it sort of also makes problems more solvable. We have with inclusiveness, I would say. And another gender aspect I didn't really had in the presentation, but which is maybe interesting for us as social scientists. This Jill Lepore book, we had her at the institute where I'm at right now a couple of weeks ago, and we discussed her writing. And as I said, she's tackling this big genre of national history in one volume, which is like a very male format of writing, of reading, of persona that comes into it. And somewhere, I think in the foreword or somewhere else, she has this picture, like I'm weaving together these little stories carefully, like you would clip a baby's fingernails. And we asked her, how did you come up with this picture for your work? And she said, yeah, I'm looking for descriptions and metaphors for work that are usually excluded from academic language and experiences that are usually excluded from this sort of discourse because they are labeled as typically female, caring, whatsoever sort of activities. And that was a very telling example of how you also have to think of these gender terms, not only in terms of objects of study or theme you can study, but also something that sort of should inform your own practices of writing and perceiving maybe things.
I actually mentioned gender once, very briefly I admit, as one of the dimensions of the standard. Sociological concepts and models upon standpoints. But there's another aspect. Okay, thank you. There's another aspect I wonder. I have wondered about several times. The community of sociological theory scholars, not only in Germany but worldwide, as far as I see, was ever a very predominantly male community, different from some other sociological communities, and it is still so. I have some partial answers, but they don't satisfy me really.
Only a small follow-up to Sina's point from my part, because I think the overemphasis on the super inclusiveness of the nation state is part of methodological nationalism, in my view. And in the little book I try to popularize by showing the cover on the last slide, which has just been published, Limits to Democracy. I mentioned that in the talk only marginally. I try to show that there are within inequalities structured by class and by status, so by political and economic subordination and by the market competition principle. And I think gender, ethnicity, economic class, well, they all play out at the intersection of this vertical and horizontal axes of social inequality within countries, and then are directly and indirectly influenced by between country inequalities.
So, last chance for a question.
Yeah, I'm happy you didn't have to do that again. I was a bit shy because my question is rather provocative. So, well, it seemed to me that actually we didn't discuss a lot about theory so far. And what I mean is that all the discussion was about the usefulness of certain initial distinctions and their adaptation to more generalized contexts, their origins, their history, and that by using different of those distinctions can point out each other's blind spots very well, and that we might use a lot of those distinctions. But wouldn't theory be more like a concept of how to relate those different initial distinctions? And that was something that I was missing. And I was wondering, because of the title, have the great theories become obsolete? I mean, in this discussion right here, we were discussing about different kinds of theories, more like they are middle range theories rather than great theories that we need to have an adequate description of the world. But do you, as the people who know those theories best, think that it is possible to relate those theories to each other in a higher theoretical way? Or would you say that we just have to abandon this universalist approach and say, well, let's just have different kinds of initial distinctions and relational concepts that derive from them and then switch from perspective to perspective?
Conference that I would have us think about is what really is the distinction between grand theory and, say, middle range theories. I don't think that distinction has been very useful. In the American context, it was Parsons who proposed the idea of a grand theory, and Parsons' theory to me was not grand at all because it was always capturing a particular dimension of social life. It was only thinking about the world in terms of a certain distinction, functionality, or so on. So even grand theory that we have called grand theory, to me, is always operating from distinctions that are actually not grand in the sense that they're any bigger. They're all on the more or less the same plane, I would argue. I think the real grand theory would have to be a theory that is more spatially extensive, a concept that captures a spatial extension maybe on a more global level. And in that sense, I think that the only real grand theory would be a theory of the human. There'd have to be some kind of ability to come up with a theory of the human, and I don't think that's possible. I do think all theories, grand or not, necessarily are selective, and you could call it subjective, but I would just say selective and provincial in that sense. So I actually don't believe in such a thing as grand theory. I just don't think it ever exists. It's never grand in the sense of going above and beyond the distinction that it presumably is encompassing into a singular system.
I think your observation is right, but the reason is I would guess that for lack of time, the grand theories remained rather implicit in our presentations. And I agree, I don't like the word grand either. So in the keynote this morning from Nancy Cartwright, we heard about wide theories. That was her understanding, and I think we do have wide theories, theories that are wider than others, than these middle-range theories, in the sense that they are more abstract, so they are more general and can be applied to much more cases and phenomena than smaller theories. And we do have them. We do have them as theories about modern society. Some of the names were dropped in between, like capitalism or differentiation or inequalities. Culture should be added. We do have these theory families, these large families of related theories that all have the same ambition to be general, to deliver general models about how modernity works. We do have them, and they were implicitly always present here.
Maybe just to connect to that, I think that was a very rich question also in another sense. Uwe Schimank was talking about the problem or the dilemma of plurality, right? I think you hinted at that as well. So we have, even if we say all these, so each of us has a vocabulary and a very refined one, I hope, to describe social reality and is working on that from his or her perspective. There is the observation that others are working at the same time with other vocabularies from other perspectives that can be historicized, as Julian is reminding us, and should be, right? So that we're aware of the actual perspective, the provincial perspective from which we are universalizing when we do theory. So But can that be the end point of the discussion, right? So that's one question I take from your comment. And I believe it shouldn't. I think it should be a challenge for each of our theories to react to the sensibilities coming from the standpoints of the others. So if Julian teaches us we could think about racial divide going through world society, right? So then each and every sociological scholar interested in building a theory of world society should be interested in that. And how could, say, if you're a system theorist, how could you make sense of that argument? How could you build this in? You can connect maybe to the sensibilities, right? So they don't have to, we could say that's a challenge of integration maybe, or whatever we want to call that. At least it should be an ongoing dialogue where you're engaged in connecting to the sensibilities coming from other standpoints. And I think it's very useful to think of this in terms of what Julian suggested, right? There's always a standpoint behind these seemingly universalized theories, which leads them to pay attention to certain things and not others. But widening the attention is always possible, right? And I think that's what I take from this discussion, also over the last few years among us, that's the real challenge for theory, to widening your own scope of attention constantly by reading other theories as well, and not just sticking to your own.
No, just very quickly, I think the way I think about it is from a philosopher of science, Ronald Gere, who has this approach which I adopt, which is to think of theories as maps, and I think of social theories as maps, right? You can never have a whole map of Berlin. There's always, a map is always selective, right? So you have a subway map, you have a road map. The subway map tells you nothing about the roads tell you nothing about the subways, and you can never have a full map of Berlin. A true map of Berlin is just Berlin, and you can never have, right, a full representation of everything that goes on in Berlin, and I think of theories that way. And so I think when Parsons claimed that he has a grand theory, or someone might claim that grand theory, I think they're just offering a map of something that they think is spatially big, but they don't realize is actually missing all kinds of other logics and social processes. And they're trying to make their map the universal map, and I just don't think there's such a thing.
All right, so I guess we're finishing now. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you again to our panelists for the excellent talks, the interesting discussion. I hope we see each other in other contexts.